By the end of June, the basement had become something between a laboratory and a war factory. Every table was buried beneath flasks, crucibles, and battered tin cans labeled Sample 7A, Mixture 12B, Soap Base, Palmitic. The once quiet corridors of Harvard's chemistry building now echoed with the scrape of typewriters and the rhythmic clink of glass stirring rods. The project had already attracted attention far beyond Cambridge. A messenger from Washington had arrived that week with a metal briefcase handcuffed to his wrist. Inside were sealed orders from the Chemical Warfare Service. Fieser broke the wax seal in front of the man. Directive 181. Development of incendiary gel compound for field application. Capable of sustained combustion and surface adherence in tropical and urban environments. In the margin, someone from the army had written in pencil, "Japan's cities are wood. Make something that burns wood." Fieser closed the folder and set it aside without comment. The tests grew bolder. They started burning small wooden models, miniature huts made of balsa and plywood, constructed to match the dimensions of Japanese homes as described in reconnaissance reports. The scientists placed them on a gravel lot behind the building, coating the roofs with their sticky orange mixture. When ignited, the flames spread unnaturally. The gel ran down the sides, pooling beneath the model, then surged upward again, as if drawn by invisible hands. Within seconds, the entire structure was engulfed. Weeks covered his mouth as acrid smoke filled the air. "It won't go out," he said. "It's not supposed to," Fieser answered. The fire hissed and bubbled for nearly 3 minutes. When it finally died, nothing remained but a blackened outline. The air smelled of burnt oil and salt. A military liaison standing beside them, Captain Harold Sands of the Chemical Warfare Service, took notes on a clipboard. "Perfect," he said. "That's what we need." He didn't mean it cruelly. To him, it was just another success in a war that demanded results. A few days later, Fieser received a visit from Vannevar Bush, head of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, OSRD. Bush had the calm, distant expression of a man who had already read too many casualty reports. "I trust you understand the importance of this work," Bush said, pacing the laboratory floor. "Every day the Japanese dig deeper into the Pacific. The Marines will need fire that doesn't wash away in the rain." Fieser nodded, though the words sat heavily in his chest. Bush continued, "This isn't just chemistry anymore. It's logistics, strategy. We're fighting a war of resources, not ideals." The conversation ended with a simple handshake and an unspoken understanding. The Harvard project was no longer academic, it was operational. In late June, under the secrecy of midnight, the first shipment of napalm samples left Cambridge for the U.S. Army testing grounds at Dugway Proving Ground, Utah. Packed in small tin drums, the gel was marked paint compound, hazardous. Inside one drum, Weeks had slipped a folded note. "This burns longer than anything we've ever made. Be careful." When the first field test report returned 2 weeks later, it was astonishingly brief. Result: ignition immediate. Duration 3 minutes, 42 seconds. Adhesion excellent. Target area fully consumed. The U.S. Army approved mass testing the following day. At Harvard, the scientists began experimenting with different mixtures, adding magnesium powder, rubber, even powdered sulfur. The lab air shimmered with heat, and every bench bore scars of blackened flame. A single mistake could ignite the room. One afternoon, it nearly did. A flask shattered when the mixture overheated, splattering gel across the concrete floor. It caught fire instantly, rolling like liquid fire. The students froze. "Sand!" Fieser shouted. "Not water!" They smothered the flames with sandbags, the heat curling the soles of their shoes. When the smoke cleared, the floor was pocked and black, the air dense with oily fumes. Weeks stared at the damage. "We could have burned the whole building down." Fieser wiped sweat from his brow. "Now imagine it over a city." That night, Fieser sat alone in his office, the typewriter keys echoing through the empty hall. He began drafting the official progress memorandum for Washington. His language was restrained, methodical, almost detached. The 27th of June, 1942, incendiary gel compound demonstrates controllable viscosity and reliable ignition. Adherence to surfaces, metal, wood, brick, remains high. Estimated thermal yield, 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. Simple to manufacture, economical in large quantities. Recommend immediate evaluation for field deployment. He paused, staring at the words. Then, with deliberate care, he added a final line. Potential humanitarian risks acknowledged. Further ethical review pending. He never sent that version. Instead, he replaced the last sentence with potential for large-scale application confirmed. As dawn broke over Cambridge, the laboratory windows glowed faintly from the streetlights. The war felt closer now, closer than it had ever been. Somewhere in the Pacific, U.S. Marines were fighting for coral airstrips and jungle trails. Somewhere in Germany, cities burned from Allied bombers. Here, in a quiet American university, men in white coats were teaching fire to obey. Fieser stood at the basement door before locking it for the night. The smell of gasoline lingered in his hands. He looked down at the tray that had started it all, its blackened surface still marked with the outline of the gel's first burn. He closed the lights, pocketed the key, and whispered to no one, "We've made something the world won't forget." 2 days later, a courier arrived with a sealed envelope stamped Top Secret, NDRC. Inside, a single memo bore the title Incendiary Gel Compound, Field Potential, approved for accelerated production and tactical deployment testing. Below the signature line, in thick blue ink, someone had written, "Forward to Wright Field for ordnance adaptation." The war had claimed its newest weapon. In a small, windowless basement under Harvard Square, the scientists of the free world had given fire a body. It would not rest again for decades. The wind tore across the Utah desert, carrying with it the metallic taste of dust and alkali. Inside the chain-link perimeter of the U.S. Army's Dugway Proving Ground, rows of wooden test structures stood like miniature villages, rows of houses, barracks, even mock city blocks modelled after enemy blueprints. The men called it Japtown. Each building was carefully constructed to mirror the wooden homes and paper screens of Tokyo's neighborhoods. Every nail, window frame, and roof tile had been chosen from intelligence photos smuggled out of the Pacific. The army didn't just want to destroy targets, they wanted to understand how to make them burn. The Harvard compound, now formally designated Incendiary Gel No. 4, had arrived in steel drums marked Paint Lubricant. Few of the soldiers unloading them knew what the substance was, only that it was classified for ordnance development. Lieutenant Robert Neely of the Chemical Warfare Service, 27 years old and straight from the University of Michigan, supervised the operation. His orders were simple: observe combustion properties, record temperature, and measure duration. By 10 a.m., the desert sun had already turned the air into a haze. A team of technicians lined up the drums, pouring thick orange gel into small steel troughs. The smell was unmistakable, a heavy sweetness of gasoline cut with the bitter sting of soap. When the ignition signal came, Neely raised his hand. "Light it." A soldier struck a flare and tossed it into the trough. The effect was instantaneous. The gel bloomed into a roaring wall of orange, rising 6 feet high, shimmering with heat distortion. Unlike liquid fuel, it didn't spread outward, it stuck, crawling slowly along the wood, clinging like molten glue. The flames hissed with a strange, almost liquid sound, bubbling and popping as air pockets burst inside the gel. "Temperature!" Neely shouted. A corporal squinted at the thermocouple. 1,200 degrees and climbing. Within 40 seconds, the mock-house was gone. The gel had burned through the support beams, leaving a skeleton of glowing nails and soot. Neely lowered his clipboard. God help the man standing in that. In Washington, the test results reached the National Defense Research Committee within a week. The report was clinical, devoid of adjectives or emotion. Combustion sustained under all atmospheric conditions. Material retains flame in wind up to 25 miles per hour. Thermal yield exceeds phosphorus by factor of 3. Duration 3.4 minutes. Recommended for large-scale field testing. But behind those numbers, a quiet unease was spreading. Some within the OSRD questioned whether such a weapon designed to cling and burn without discrimination crossed a moral line. Colonel Stewart of the Chemical Warfare Service dismissed the concern. "Fire's been a weapon since man discovered it," he told the review board. "We're just refining it." The board agreed. Production moved ahead. By March 1943, the compound had been standardized under a new name, napalm, from naphthenic and palmitic acids. It was efficient, cheap, and most importantly simple. A single 5-gallon can of gasoline mixed with the powdered agent could be made on any base, anywhere in the world. Fieser's lab in Cambridge now operated under armed guard. What began as an experiment had become part of the U.S. war machine. Harvard students walking past the chemistry building had no idea that inside, technicians were mixing batches of a weapon that would soon scorch cities thousands of miles away. Fieser himself travelled to Dugway that spring. He stood beside Neely during another test, this one involving an entire replica of a German apartment block. The ignition team triggered the charge remotely. Within moments, the firestorm erupted. Flames licked across walls, rolled down corridors, and pooled in corners. The oxygen vanished from the air, replaced by a sound Fieser would never forget, the hollow whomp of fire feeding on itself. "Remarkable adhesion," Neely said, covering his face with a handkerchief. "It burns into the wood grain." Fieser didn't answer. He was staring at the building's silhouette perfectly framed against the sky, black smoke rising in a pillar so dense it turned the morning into dusk. That night, in the officers' quarters, Neely poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of Fieser. "You don't look proud," Neely said quietly. Fieser managed a thin smile. "Pride isn't the word. It works too well." "You think the Germans or the Japanese will hesitate if they had it?" "No," Fieser said. "That's the trouble." Back in Washington, the Joint Chiefs of Staff approved napalm for operational use. In the Pacific, Marine Corps planners began requesting shipments for use in flamethrowers and aircraft bombs. A memo dated May 1943, now declassified, recorded the moment the weapon entered official service. Subject: adoption of gel-type incendiary compound for tactical application. Designation: ANM-69 Incendiary Bomb Cluster Unit. Primary manufacturer: Standard Oil Development Company under OSRD contract. Composition: gasoline thickened with aluminum naphthenate palmitate salts. Distribution: priority: Pacific Theater. Within weeks, the first batches of napalm left the United States aboard Navy supply ships bound for Hawaii, Australia, and the Solomon Islands. By summer, Dugway's test range was littered with the remains of burned villages, rows of charred chimneys jutting from the sand like tombstones. Technicians swept up ashes, catalogued the debris, and wrote their reports in silence. One entry, penned by Lieutenant Neely himself, captured what the datasheets could not. The substance adheres to flesh as it does to wood. When ignited, water has no effect. Sand is the only suppressant. Duration of agony unknown. He never submitted that report. It remained folded in his field journal, buried beneath equations and diagrams. In Cambridge, as autumn fell, Harvard's campus returned to its quiet rhythm. Students hurried between classes, unaware that beneath their feet the war's most infamous weapon had been born. Fieser's team received no medals, no public recognition. Their work was filed away in the vaults of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, sealed under restricted access, classified ordnance. But one evening, as he left the lab for the last time, Fieser paused at the doorway. He looked back at the benches, covered in glassware and metal drums, the birthplace of a weapon that could erase a city block in minutes. He turned off the lights and whispered, almost to himself, "We've made fire obedient. God forgive us for how it will be used." Wright Field smelled of oil, hot metal, and the steady, humming confidence of American industry. Where Harvard had taught fire to stick, the engineers at the Army Air Force's research establishment taught fire to fly. Drawings covered the walls of hangar, 8-line diagrams, sectional views, and side-by-side comparisons of bomb casings. Men in grease-stained jackets paced between benches, arguing about fuse settings, fragmentation, and dispersal patterns, as if discussing engines and range. The problem presented to them from Washington was practical and narrow. Napalm worked on a scale of laboratory drums and test huts. How could the same gel be delivered from the air and spread over an urban landscape in a single pass? How could a bomber, operating at altitude and speed, scatter a sticky, combustible agent across a wide area without losing instrumentation, without endangering its own crew? At Wright Field, the answer took shape in the most unromantic of places, the ordnance factory floor. Engineers adapted existing bomb technologies into a delivery system that would fragment and scatter the gel in a pattern designed not merely to burn, but to choke a neighborhood in flame. The solution was simple in principle and fiendish in its engineering. Encase napalm in small, thin-walled tubes, pack them into a cluster canister, and arrange for the canister to open at low altitude, showering the sky with ignitable jellied fuel. The M69 incendiary cluster was the product of a dozen incremental ideas welded into a single mechanism. Each M69 was a small, corkscrew-shaped bomblet, an aluminum body packed with gel and fitted with a simple time fuse. They were light, cheap, and designed to break apart on release, their contents rained down like molten beads. Engineers ran calculations about spread, convergence, and burn patterns the way pilots ran theirs for fuel and airspeed. Field tests were exhaustive. At a practice range outside Dayton, technicians attached M69 canisters to test racks under a B-29 mock-up suspended on hydraulic arms. The canisters released their contents at the appointed time. The bomblets fanned out and detonated in mid-air, igniting into hundreds of points of flame. The resulting conflagration was not the bright, instantaneous explosion of a high explosive. It was a spreading, rolling fire. An aggregate of small fires that joined into a larger inferno as they struck rooftops, tar paper, and clapboard. Captains from the Air Forces scribbled numbers into logbooks. Coverage per canister, one memo recorded, exceeds conventional incendiaries by factor of 4-6 inches timber film constructions. Another note, less clinical, captured the mood in the small observation shelter. It's like throwing hot paint over everything. Wright Field's engineers did not labor in isolation. Design improvements flowed from Detroit and Long Island machine shops and aircraft plants converting to ordnance production. The same assembly lines that had learned to stamp out wings and engine mounts now stamped canisters and fuse collars. Women who had filled rivet holes and ran jigs learned to pack gel mixtures into small tubes with surgical precision. Production metrics, parts per hour, rejection rates, mean time to assembly joined scientific charts of burn temperature and adhesion. The weapon was, in every sense, an industrial achievement. Not all of the debates were technical. In the corridors of the Air Force's research section, younger officers argued with older ordnance specialists about tactics. Use it only for point targets. One insisted ammo dumps, shipyards, known troop concentrations. Another replied, it doesn't care about lines on a map. Where fuel and timber exist, it will do its work. Practicality won. The quantity of ordnance America could put into the air meant targets would be chosen by opportunity as much as by doctrine. The M69's first operational assignments were modest and guarded trials, with medium-range bombers, live drops over isolated ranges in the Pacific, limited trials in the European theater to test patterns under different wind shear and humidity conditions. Each test added pages to an expanding dossier. Meteorological corrections, wind drift tables, ignition reliability under damp weather. The reports circulated through the same channels that had first borne Fieser's memo. OSRD, Chemical Warfare Service, and the Air Staff. A single memo from late 1943, now preserved in the Air Force archives, summarized the technical conclusion bluntly. M69 cluster distribution provides superior incendiary coverage against light timber and shingle construction, effective in urban firestorms when delivered in volume. The phrasing was sterile. The implication, when read aloud in officers' clubs, was not. Production scaled quickly. Factories turned from prototypes to quantity runs. The canister design simplified. Fuse reliability improved. By mid-1944, ordnance depots across the United States held thousands of M69 seconds packed in wooden crates, ready to be slotted into bomb bays. Wright Field's diagrams became pocket references for squadron ordnance officers. The gel itself, once a Harvard secret, was now also an industrial commodity. Standard oil refineries altered blending processes, chemical plants powdered aluminum soaps by the ton. The country's logistic tail lengthened to accommodate a new kind of payload, one that demanded meteorological windows, careful low-level delivery, and, above all, mass. Engineers always like to measure success in numbers. Tacticians in outcomes. The two met in planning rooms where mission commanders matched M69 allotments to targets. If the goal was to produce fire on a mass scale, numbers mattered. Dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of canisters. Mass is the point, one ordnance planner wrote. Not an individual bomblet, but the aggregate of their effects. The B-29, still new and temperamental, proved the logical platform. Its range placed Japanese urban areas within reach from Pacific bases. Modifying the superfortress to carry clusters required reinforcing bomb racks and rewiring release circuits to handle low-altitude dispersal. The crews trained in mock-ups. Navigators adjusted arrival windows to account for the delicate moment of release when the canisters must open at the right height to maximize spread without endangering the aircraft. By late 1944, a quiet consensus had formed inside the planning rooms. The weapon was ready. The scientists had given the Air Force a new tool. The industrial complex had learned to make it in quantity. The pilots and ordnance crews had practiced its delivery until the motions were muscle memory. All that remained was targets, and the list was long. One final technical report, appended to the project file at Wright Field and stamped with the terse approval of the air staff, summed the engineers' achievement in their own language. Deliverable incendiary cluster, M69. Reliable ignition, predictable spread, mass-producible. Recommended for strategic and tactical application where urban timber construction predominates. The recommendation carried the force of policy. The weapon moved from hangar shelves to theater manifests. In the months that followed, Napalm would leave Ohio and cross the Pacific not as an idea, but as a canister of ordered destruction, engineered, manufactured, and delivered with the same cold precision that had built the airplane that carried it. At Wright Field, men chalked the final test numbers on blackboards and moved on to the next problem. They had taught fire to fly. They had taught it to spread. They had not, in their notes or their schedules, the moment when the first city would meet both lessons at once. Tokyo had always been a city of thin things, the paper screens that framed private rooms, the tightly packed wooden houses that rose like matchboxes from narrow lanes, the dry timber that smelled of sun and cedar. In the pre-war years, that quality had made the city intimate, even fragile. In the spring of 1945, it made the city mortal. The mission began like any other briefing at North Field, Tinian. On the 9th of March, 1945, Colonel Curtis E. LeMay called his officers and told them plainly, "We would not try to destroy Japanese industry alone. We would destroy the city that sheltered it." The tactics had been refined over months of study. Low-altitude night approaches, incendiary clusters optimized for wooden construction, saturation rather than precision. The weapon was the M69 hundreds of bomblets packed into cluster canisters. Each bomblet a small tube of napalm designed to break, scatter, and ignite on contact. At 7:15 p.m., under a light moon, 279 B-29, Superfortresses lifted from the Pacific Islands, their bellies full of canisters and their crews rehearsed in the choreography of release. The mission logs read like a surgeon's schedule: altitude, heading, wind corrections, time to burst. Pilots spoke of engines and navigation, not of flame. The men had been taught to think in terms of damage assessment and bomb pattern. Their training left little room for the human geography of what the city meant to those who lived inside it. The approach over Tokyo was quiet, mechanical. Radar returns glowed in the dark like constellations on screens. At the appointed moments, the canisters released, the bomblets fanned outward, and LeMay's crews watched in the glow of instrument panels as hundreds of points of orange made contact with rooftops. The M69 seconds did what they had been engineered to do. They stuck, they burned, and they multiplied. From the air, the destruction took on a gruesome simplicity. A single block would flare, then a second, then a third. Within minutes, the contiguous flames merged, racing across a landscape of timber and paper. Fire, fed by oil from tanks and by the inflammable furnishings of ordinary homes, moved like water through alleys and up into eaves. The smoke rose in a column that turned the moonless night into a day of ash. Pilots reported the sight without rhetorical flourish. The logs noted extensive conflagration, spread rapid, smoke column visible from 150 miles. On the ground, the experience was different, chaotic, immediate, and terrible. Civil defense records and later translated diaries described streets filled with people moving blindly, carrying bundles and children, seeking rivers or parks where the fire might skip. Many of the city's wards had no adequate shelters. Those that existed were overwhelmed. The napalm-laden bomblets had a cruel property in Tokyo's environment. They ignited thatch, paper, and wooden frames with speed unmatched by previous incendiaries, and, once, burning, clung, and spread. Water buckets and small pumps, the traditional means of firefighting in many districts, were helpless before the scale and intensity of the blaze. Witnesses wrote afterward in measured, stunned language. A merchant's ledger, smuggled out of the city and preserved in post-war interrogations, recorded a single line. "We tried to run to the river. The fire ran faster." Fire brigade reports those that survived spoke of hoses melting and equipment failing under the heat. Local wardens who had once coordinated blackout drills now watched entire neighborhoods collapse into flame. The human toll was on a scale that confounded the early planners. Contemporary U.S. mission assessments described the raid by numbers. Square miles burned, tons of ordnance expended, percentage of urban area affected. After the war, technical surveys and translations of Japanese records attempted to quantify the loss: lives, homes, industrial output. What emerged from the weight of statistics was horrific but incomplete. Tens of thousands killed, an immense population rendered homeless, entire districts erased from the map. The estimates varied. Historians and commissions would debate the exact totals for decades. For many survivors, the count mattered less than the memory, the heat, the screaming, the sky that rained burning embers. The tactical effect, from the military perspective, was immediate and stark. Where earlier raids had damaged factories and disrupted transport, the March attack created a citywide inferno that consumed residential quarters that housed workers, small shops, and auxiliary production facilities. Rail timetables were shattered for weeks. Small workshops that formed the backbone of wartime Japanese subsistence manufacturing were gone. The raid demonstrated a strategic reality the air staff had suspected. In a society of largely wooden domestic construction, massed incendiaries could collapse production capacity simply by destroying the people who made the machines and the neighborhoods that supported them. For the men who had devised the weapon in laboratories and factories, the reports reached them like cold telegrams. Dr. Louis Fieser in Cambridge, whose name appeared in the chain of discovery, read the initial mission summaries with a professional detachment that hid a different response in private pages and letters, questions that would not appear on official forms. Harvard Notes and OSRD Minutes recorded the scientific assessments: effective patterning, good ignition, reliability, mass production validation, None of those documents could capture the human geography of rubble and grief that began to be described in letters and survivor accounts. From Tokyo, Japanese military and civil authorities prepared after-action reports that mixed technical observation with grief. Engineers noted how the M69 bomblets penetrated rooflines and lodged in attics, where they burned unseen until the structure collapsed. Fire Control Corps recorded inadequate water supplies and the near impossibility of managing conflagrations, mobilized at so many points simultaneously. Statistical tables noted the loss of household goods and the collapse of municipal infrastructure. If the language was bureaucratic, its consequence was not. Across the Pacific, the reaction was mixed. Commanders praised the effectiveness diplomats, and some civilians praised the prospect of shortening the war's length. Others, reading the same dispatches, felt unease. Letters from junior officers to family members described the visual of a city gone like tinder and posed brittle questions about what victory might demand. A few clergymen and academics in the United States debated the morality of incinerating civilian quarters to reduce industrial production. Their voices were minor amid the chorus of strategic necessities. Operationally, the raid taught hard lessons. The M69 bomblets worked best where construction was light and dense. In heavily masonry-built districts, the effect was not the same. Wind and humidity proved decisive on other nights. The same pattern of delivery produced only scattered fires. On this night, it produced a conflagration. The mission planners folded those lessons into subsequent operations, refining weather windows, release altitudes, and target sectors to maximize saturated effects. In Tokyo's aftermath, the scene of ruin was almost beyond the language of report forms. Streets that had once thrummed with the commerce of small shops and cooking fires now lay under ash. The survivors spoke in the manner of those who had known a city intimately and then watched its particularities vanish. Favorite trees gone. Childhood alleys vanished beneath clinker and collapsed timbers. The smell of everyday life replaced by the taste of metal and smoke. When the formal surveys were drafted military, scientific, and humanitarian, they did what statistics must do. They turned horror into data. Square miles burned, numbers of houses, estimates of casualties, production losses. These metrics would be cited in after-action files, used to justify follow-on strikes, and later passed by historians. But for anyone who had stood beneath those blackened skies, no ledger could contain the shape of loss. The night of March 9-10, 1945, would remain a pivot in the history of aerial warfare. It was a demonstration of industrialized destruction, science, engineering, and logistics combined to produce a single, terrible instrument. For the planners and pilots, it marked a capability validated. For the men and women who endured it, it marked a fracture, an ordinary city transformed into a vast field of heat and ruin. Years later, when memorials and inquiries would try to reconcile the technical accomplishment with the human cost, participants on both sides would return to that night with different languages. Pilots and ordnance officers would cite pattern statistics and mission, success. Survivors and civic records would recount the heat, the sound, and the ash. The documents could stand side by side, they would never fully meet. On Tinian and in Washington, the success of the M69 seconds and the napalm gel became, in official terms, another data point in the logic of victory. On the burned streets of Tokyo, it became a moment of irrevocable loss, one that would leave an imprint on the memory of Japan and on the conscience of those who had designed the fire and those who had watched it spread. By mid-1943, the napalm formula had moved from the basement laboratories of Harvard into the open expanses of Wright Field, Florida. Here, under the humid southern sun and the watchful eyes of Army and Navy officers, the incendiary gel was subjected to rigorous tests. Dr. Louis Fieser had flown south for consultations, notebook in hand, to observe the first field trials beyond controlled glassware. The testing range was a series of wooden structures, small houses, sheds, and stacks of lumber that simulated typical Pacific Island villages. Bomb technicians filled M69 bomblets with the gel. meticulously measuring viscosity and ignition reliability. When the first canisters were dropped from low-flying aircraft, the results were immediate. The napalm burned hotter, clung longer, and consumed targets far more thoroughly than previous incendiaries. Observers noted the sticky, almost tenacious quality of the gel, which spread over walls and soaked through thatched roofing in seconds. Thermometers recorded temperatures that far exceeded ordinary gasoline fires, and datasheets were filled with precision. Yet behind the scientific triumph was an uneasy awareness. Memo exchanges between Fieser, the Chemical Warfare Service, and the National Defense Research Committee hinted at the moral ambiguity of their creation. One typed note, stamped "Top Secret," read, "Effective against wooden and thatch construction. Collateral civilian damage highly probable. Operational guidance required." The language was bureaucratic, but the meaning was clear. The gel's capacity to burn through human habitations was a known consequence. Fieser himself wrote in a private journal, later recovered in post-war archives, "We have succeeded beyond the laboratory's imagination, yet I cannot ignore the human dimension. It is one thing to ignite a model hut, another to imagine it over a populated island." Those words reflected the internal tension among scientists who were accustomed to controlled reactions in flasks, now confronted with the reality that their creation was designed for lethal effectiveness. Field officers, however, focused on metrics: spread radius, ignition time, canister reliability. Daily briefings included photographic evidence of structures consumed within minutes. Recommendations emphasized deployment altitude, release angles, and bomblet spacing, all technical parameters intended to maximize effect while minimizing failure. The human consequences were abstracted into tables, graphs, and percentages. By the end of July, the Chemical Warfare Service finalized operational orders for the initial use of napalm in combat. The conclusion of the field trials was unequivocal. The gel would be deployed against fortified positions and, when necessary, against urban areas in the Pacific Theater to reduce Japanese resistance. In Washington, military planners began drafting targeting protocols, while scientists prepared technical manuals for ordnance officers. Napalm had moved from accident to weapon. Its promise was undeniable, its horror undeniable as well. In secret memos and confidential briefings, the duality was clear. It was a scientific achievement, a tool of unprecedented destructive power, and a moral test whose consequences would only become visible on the battlefields of the Pacific Islands. When the guns fell quiet and the surrender documents were signed, the physical tally of fire did not stop adding up. Cities smoldered, survivors picked through ash, and governments began the work of counting. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey sent teams across Japan with clipboards and cameras, recording what the night raids and their incendiaries had left behind. Their mission was dispassionate: to measure military effect, to estimate production losses, and to judge whether strategic bombing had shortened the war. The technical findings were unambiguous in the language of engineers. Incendiary raids against Japan's largely wooden urban fabric had destroyed labor housing, small shop industries, and the dispersed supply network that sustained war production. Where precision strikes had failed to collapse wartime output, saturation incendiaries had removed the human and logistical scaffolding that kept factories running. The survey's analysts noted the grim arithmetic. A burned city was not merely a lost factory, it was a population dispersal, a set of lost skills, a transportation network severed. In the short term, production declined and mobility stalled. The human ledger was far harder to secure. Casualty estimates varied. Municipal records, refugee lists, and later demographic studies produced different totals. Some early post-war compilations placed civilian fatalities from the large incendiary raids in the tens of thousands for single attacks, aggregated across the campaign. Conservative contemporary estimates and later scholarly syntheses produced figures that were far larger numbers that would be argued over in classrooms and courtrooms for decades. Whatever the precise count, the scale of suffering was unmistakable. Entire neighborhoods erased, families displaced, and survivors who carried the imprint of flame in body and memory. In Washington, the survey's first interim reports were circulated within the military and scientific establishment. They confirmed what planners had argued. Mass incendiary operations produced results when matched to an adversary's urban construction. They also raised questions the engineers could not answer: questions of proportionality, of post-war reconstruction, and of responsibility. The Office of Scientific Research and Development and the Chemical Warfare Service compiled technical appendices. The War Department filed logistics summaries. Congress, receiving declassified summaries, convened informal hearings to record testimony from planners and to assess lessons for future air campaigns. Scientists who had worked on the project were quietly summoned to briefings and panels. Some were praised for technical ingenuity. Others found themselves asked to explain, in public and private testimony, the ethical calculus that had guided their work. Dr. Louis Fieser received no reprimand and no public condemnation. The wartime record treated his contribution as a civilian laboratory achievement applied to military necessity. He returned to Harvard and to teaching. In lectures and departmental minutes he continued to publish on organic chemistry and reagents. But in private correspondence and marginalia there lingered notes of unease, phrases crossed out, a sentence begun and never finished. The Strategic Bombing Survey itself ventured into moral territory despite its technical remit. Its analysts observed that incendiary bombing had been far more destructive to civilian life than anticipated by pre-war planners. They warned military planners that the tool's utility would be shaped by context, available industrial capacity, population density, and political implications. The survey's recommendations were pragmatic: better intelligence, better timing, and greater attention to post-strike stabilization, but they also acknowledged that a weapon that could erase urban life demanded continued ethical scrutiny. The tactical success of napalm and the cluster systems created an uncomfortable paradox. The same technical properties that made the weapon militarily useful: adhesion, high thermal, yield, and persistence, also made it intrinsically indiscriminate in dense civilian settings. Military doctrine, which separated combatants from non-combatants on paper, found in napalm a blunt instrument that blurred that distinction when used against towns and cities. Within doctrinal papers and closed briefings, lawyers and ethicists debated proportionality. In field orders, mission commanders made pragmatic choices about target selection and weather windows. Outside government panels, the memory of the fires began to enter public discourse. Survivors' testimonies reached Allied ears through translated reports and humanitarian intermediaries. Images of blackened streets and skeletal frames circulated in press dispatches and later wartime documentaries. Those accounts fed the conversations of post-war reconstruction: who would rebuild, who would be rehoused, and how a devastated civilian population would be fed and resettled. Aid convoys, occupation authorities, and municipal engineers confronted the immediate task of coping with shelter, water, and sanitation in the shadow of charred neighborhoods. A further consequence of the wartime use of napalm unfolded almost immediately after the war. The technology did not die with hostilities. The compound's practicality, a gel that could be manufactured with available petroleum and fatty acid feedstocks, meant it could be produced cheaply and in quantity. Military planners in subsequent conflicts rediscovered the same logic that had driven its wartime adoption: an inexpensive, mass-producible incendiary, with decisive effects on timber construction and field fortifications. In the Korean Peninsula, and then later in Southeast Asia, napalm reappeared in new uniforms and under different political banners, its lineage traced back, unmistakably, to a basement in Cambridge and a series of tests in the Utah desert. By the time the first post-war inquiries closed, the official posture in the United States was measured. The weapon had been a wartime innovation applied to a strategic problem. The men and women who had developed it were returned to academic chairs and industrial posts. The state archived technical files and incorporated lessons into doctrine. But the human echo remained in memorials, in survivor testimony, and in a generation of technicians who had seen the practical limits of technological optimism. For those who had watched napalm's first fires, the moral dilemma persisted. The calculus of victory and the calculus of suffering remained in tension. The reports and memos assembled by the survey and the private journals of the scientists offered no final absolution. They offered instead a sober ledger. That technological success could be measured in operational effect, and that operational effect could be measured, inexorably, in burned lives. By 1947, the world had shifted beneath the feet of men who had spent the previous half-decade immersed in laboratories, airfields, and field reports. The ashes of Japan still lay thick in the memories of pilots, engineers, and civilians alike. In Cambridge, Harvard's laboratories had returned to quiet work on polymer chemistry and medicinal compounds, yet the shadow of napalm, both as a scientific breakthrough and as an instrument of destruction, remained in the professional and personal consciousness of the scientists who had created it. Dr. Louis Fieser and his team were summoned by the Pentagon to brief a new generation of military planners. The discussion was no longer about defeating a single adversary in the Pacific, but about shaping doctrine for a rapidly evolving global balance of power. The United States, now possessing atomic weapons, grappled with the question of conventional versus nuclear strategy. Within these deliberations, napalm, an incendiary compound born of gasoline and soap, represented a unique hybrid, cheap, effective, and capable of inducing terror as well as tactical advantage. It could not rival the mushroom cloud in strategic effect, but its operational flexibility and psychological impact were undeniable. The briefings highlighted lessons learned from the Pacific Theater. Field reports indicated that a P-47 Thunderbolt, or B-29 Superfortress carrying napalm bombs, could target not only wooden structures, but also supply caches, fuel depots, and vehicles. The incendiary's ability to cling to surfaces and burn for extended periods made it invaluable against fortifications and entrenched positions. However, planners also noted the devastating effects on civilian populations. Even with careful target selection, the spread of fire in urban or semi-urban areas was difficult to control, and collateral damage was often inevitable. Ethical debates, already simmering during wartime, became formalized in the new doctrine review committees, blending operational necessity with the nascent frameworks of international law. By late 1947, the U.S. Army and Air Force began experimenting with the integration of napalm into standard munitions. The lessons of testing in Utah and in the Pacific were codified in field manuals. Ground units learned to use the gel to clear bunkers, destroy supply lines, and deny terrain to enemy forces. Pilots underwent specialized training in deployment patterns, ignition sequencing, and bomb loading. At the same time, scientific teams refined the formulation. Adjustments to viscosity, ignition temperature, and adhesion properties were made to optimize the compound for aerial deployment in diverse climates, from humid jungles to temperate plains. The broader scientific community observed these developments with a mixture of admiration and unease. Journals chronicled the chemical properties, documenting how naphthenic and palmitic acids reacted with petroleum to produce a gel that burned hotter and longer than conventional gasoline. Chemists marveled at the ingenuity. Ethicists questioned the implications. University seminars debated the dual-use nature of such discoveries. Innovations born of pure research redirected to warfare, producing results that were as morally ambiguous as they were scientifically impressive. Meanwhile, former combat veterans and civilian observers contributed to the evolving discourse. Veterans recalled the Pacific raids, the initial disbelief at the stickiness of the flames, the realization that fire could spread across rooftops and through dense neighborhoods with devastating efficiency. Civilians, now rebuilding their lives in post-war Japan, recounted survival narratives how families navigated smoke-filled streets, sought shelter from falling incendiaries, and coped with the aftermath of charred homes and displaced communities. These narratives entered into post-war reports and influenced both public perception and policy deliberations in Washington. The geopolitical climate also intensified interest in incendiary weapons. With the Soviet Union emerging as a strategic competitor, U.S. Military planners sought methods to counter fortified positions and urban centers that might be defended against invasion or air attack. Napalm, with its demonstrated effectiveness in the Pacific, was seen as a reliable option for asymmetric advantages, especially in potential conflicts where conventional bombardment might be insufficient. Studies began on how the incendiary could complement other emerging technologies, including rocket-assisted bombs and early jet-delivered payloads. Analysts evaluated combinations that could maximize damage to infrastructure while minimizing exposure of aircraft and crew, a calculus rooted in efficiency but haunted by moral considerations. By 1949, these deliberations entered formal doctrine reviews. The Army's Chemical Corps, collaborating with the newly independent U.S. Air Force, issued guidelines for napalm's deployment. Emphasis was placed on precision targeting, coordination with intelligence units, and controlled burns to avoid unintended civilian casualties. The manuals detailed procedures for storage, handling, and emergency mitigation, reflecting both operational experience and lessons learned from early Pacific use. Yet even as procedural controls were formalized, the potential for misuse remained clear. Reports acknowledged that in urban areas, fires were unpredictable, and the compound's intensity rendered firefighting nearly impossible once ignition occurred. Simultaneously, napalm entered the political consciousness. Debates in Congress referenced its use in Japan and the ethical considerations for future engagements. Military officials argued the strategic necessity of maintaining a versatile arsenal, while public intellectuals and peace activists cautioned against normalizing incendiary weapons. Press coverage, although limited by Cold War sensitivities, occasionally highlighted the destructive potential, raising questions about civilian protection in wartime planning. These discussions foreshadowed the controversies that would later define napalm's role in Korea and Vietnam. Despite the growing ethical scrutiny, the scientific lineage of napalm remained a point of pride for some researchers. For Dr. Fieser, the achievement represented a culmination of organic chemistry expertise applied under urgent wartime conditions. The technical challenge of stabilizing a gel that could be mass-produced, stored safely, and deployed effectively was non-trivial, and the solution reflected decades of chemical insight. Yet, personal correspondence from this period reveals a nuanced understanding, professional accomplishment intertwined with the recognition of human cost. Marginalia in laboratory notebooks contain cautious reflections on responsibility, suggesting that even in triumph, the weight of consequence was inescapable. By 1950, napalm had transitioned from a wartime experiment into a fully institutionalized component of U.S. military capability. The lessons learned from Hiroshima, Tokyo, and other incendiary campaigns informed training, doctrine, and production priorities. Industrial processes were scaled up, supply chains optimized, and the U.S. military maintained significant reserves. Analysts projected that, in a future conflict, napalm would offer a rapid, inexpensive, and psychologically impactful option for a range of tactical scenarios. Its legacy, technical ingenuity, tactical effectiveness, and moral complexity was firmly embedded in the emerging Cold War military-industrial landscape. Thus, the weapon born of an accidental mixture of soap and gasoline in a cluttered Harvard basement had evolved into an enduring element of military strategy. It carried the duality of innovation and destruction, a reminder that scientific discovery, once harnessed for warfare, resists easy categorization. For the men and women who had witnessed its first flames, the story was one of both pride and profound ethical reflection, a narrative that would continue to resonate as the world adjusted to the uneasy peace of the post-war era. By the winter of 1951, the Korean War had escalated into a brutal conflict that tested the post-war assumptions of military planners. The United States, committed to repelling North Korean and Chinese advances, turned to all available tactical tools, including the incendiary compound that had first been mixed in a Harvard basement nearly a decade earlier. Napalm, previously confined to classified tests, Pacific raids, and doctrine manuals, was now deployed en masse, its characteristics both revered and feared. Pilots of the U.S. Air Force, flying F-80 Shooting Stars and F-84 Thunderjets, carried hundreds of gallons of the sticky gel in their wing-mounted tanks. Ground commanders coordinated strikes to dislodge enemy fortifications and destroy entrenched supply positions, often on hilly, wooded terrain that conventional explosives struggled to penetrate. Combat reports highlighted the compound's dual power. It could eradicate fortified bunkers, but it also left lasting scars on the landscape. Villages, previously untouched by conventional bombing, sometimes succumbed to the creeping, persistent flame. Field notes from the 339th Fighter Squadron recorded the operational success enemy positions, neutralized in minutes, but also detailed the difficulty in controlling collateral damage. Smoke hung low over rice paddies, and burned-out hamlets became symbols of a new, unsettling reality. Napalm was no longer a tool confined to test ranges or laboratory notebooks. It was a weapon of war in living, breathing human environments. The Korean experience also prompted further refinement of napalm formulations. Research teams, still linked to the Chemical Warfare Service and now the U.S. Army Chemical Corps, experimented with additives to optimize burn duration and adhesion under the humid Korean climate. Lessons from the Pacific, where tropical conditions sometimes altered the compound's viscosity, proved invaluable. Field engineers introduced modifications to reduce storage hazards and improve consistency under extreme temperatures. At the same time, military strategists explored combined operations with artillery and aerial bombardment, integrating napalm strikes into coordinated campaigns that maximized tactical impact while attempting to limit exposure to friendly forces. Yet, alongside operational success, the ethical and political ramifications of napalm's deployment became increasingly visible. International observers, journalists, and humanitarian organizations raised concerns over civilian casualties. Reports of burned villages and displaced populations circulated in global press outlets, sparking debates in the United Nations about the legitimacy of incendiary weapons in densely populated theaters. While U.S. military officials emphasized the precision and tactical necessity of napalm strikes, the images of scorched landscapes and suffering civilians entered the global consciousness, framing the compound as both a scientific marvel and a symbol of wartime horror. The tension between scientific achievement and moral consequence was further amplified by veterans' accounts. Pilots and ground troops who had deployed napalm in Korea offered candid reflections in post-war interviews. Some described a grim sense of awe at the gel's destructive power, recalling how it adhered to trees, rocks, and buildings, leaving behind blackened residues that burned for minutes on end. Others spoke of unease at the indiscriminate nature of fire, particularly when enemy soldiers retreated into villages or rural areas, forcing decisions that blurred the line between tactical necessity and humanitarian responsibility. These narratives, preserved in the National Archives and the oral histories collected by the UTAM-S Army Center of Military History, provided early warnings of the moral complexities that would resurface in future conflicts. By the late 1952, napalm's operational reach extended beyond Korea. In Southeast Asia, escalating tensions in Vietnam prompted preliminary deployment studies by the U.S. Military Assistance Advisory Group, MAAG. Observers noted the compound's effectiveness against dense jungle fortifications and tunnel networks employed by insurgent forces. Training manuals emphasized careful application to avoid widespread destruction of villages and civilian infrastructure, but the potential for misuse was apparent. American planners recognized that napalm could provide a rapid tactical advantage in counterinsurgency operations, particularly in scenarios where conventional bombing or ground assaults proved inadequate. At the same time, public awareness of napalm's consequences began to grow. Scientific publications and post-war military analyses described the compound's chemical composition and flammability characteristics in precise terms. Yet the broader implications, the visceral, human dimension of fire that clung to flesh, clothing, and structures remained largely absent from official discourse. Early Cold War optimism in technological superiority often overshadowed ethical reflection. Military journals celebrated the efficacy of napalm in neutralizing enemy positions, while historians and ethicists noted the growing tension between strategic utility and humanitarian risk. In the end, napalm's history by 1965 had become emblematic of the duality inherent in military technology. It was a testament to human ingenuity, the capacity to innovate under extreme pressure, and the application of chemistry to solve tactical problems. Yet it was also a stark reminder of the human cost of such innovation, a weapon that left physical and psychological scars, raised profound ethical questions, and forced society to confront the consequences of unleashing fire in ways previously unimagined. The legacy of the accidental mixture of soap and gasoline thus endured, shaping debates over warfare, technology, and morality for generations to come.